you mentioned Shadowkeep. The thing about Destiny expansions is there's always a story of the Bungie development, the behind the scenes that kind of explains the expansion. So like, obviously Shadowkeep was the one where they had just split from Activision, and their whole studio was being redesigned, literally like new buildings. They had to dedicate an entire portion of the Bungie staff to do what Activision used to do, so the publishing side of things. So now Bungie they self-publish, so it's a whole thing that an entirely separate company used to do that they did. So they restructured their whole company. So Shadowkeep, and they even kind of said that, you know, this is a little bit of a filler expansion. We're doing our best, but our whole company is being just completely overhauled. So give us a bit of space. There's a bit of leeway there. And you know, Beyond Light was basically the kind of intro of Destiny 3, where they had to rip out huge chunks of the game in order to make way for Beyond Light, Witch Queen, and Lightfall, and then Final Shape. So it was an ugly expansion. The expansion itself, I feel like some people have mixed opinions on Beyond Light, but I think Beyond Light was the expansion itself was good, but because it came alongside as a lot of bad things like sunsetting and vaulting and stasis was quite a rough introduction. I think that kind of soured it, but I think the actual content itself in Beyond Light was very solid. But there's always a story with this stuff. And then Witch Queen was unanimously one of the best expansions ever. And now Final Shape, Lightfall, again, there's a story which many people have kind of pieced together, and there's clues of evidence, and there's rumors, and there's rumblings, but we all kind of get the gist that, I mean, we all kind of know that originally they planned to do 3 expansions, the Beyond Light, Witch Queen, and Lightfall. And then they announced, in their own words, they said, we realize we need to do an additional expansion, an additional chapter. And I think I mentioned it in my video, but I think that's the key reason why a lot of people weren't happy, because they made it seem as if Final Shape was an additional expansion, as in Lightfall was still Lightfall, and then we're going to add an additional one. But what they actually is kind of clear is that Lightfall is the additional expansion, and Final Shape is what Lightfall used to be. But then it's still called Lightfall, which appears that it would be a second collapse, which has also been teased for a long time, but then that didn't happen. The Traveler left, but nothing really happened with it. So as you said, it doesn't really seem like the name Lightfall doesn't fit. They probably could have renamed it to, you know, the Neptune Adventure, because it definitely seems like a spin-off. Yeah. And then there's the thing about Strand, and it overwhelmingly does seem more likely that it would have been in Witch Queen when there would have been 3 expansions. There's a lot of kind of, you can see the seams of how they've ripped stuff apart and repackaged stuff. But going back to the story, I think that's why, honestly, I wouldn't really put too much blame, if you could say it that way, on the narrative team. I feel like the narrative team are just kind of doing what they're told by the higher ups, who are like, okay, so change of plans, we're going to do another expansion, Final Shape. We need to do another expansion called Lightfall, and can you guys make this make sense? And I think the narrative team probably has the toughest job of having to cobble this stuff together and make, because Bungie have their overarching game decisions of, okay, we're going to release this quarter here, we're going to do this thing here, based on the realities of what they can do, you know, logistically and financially, like, and development time, how much they can allocate resources to do. This is what is physically possible. And then they decide, okay, we're going to do these number of expansions. And then it's up for the narrative team to be like, okay, make this make sense. Give us a reason to be on Neptune. Give us a reason to be messing around with Strand. Kind of tie this in. And then that's where it kind of is obvious that it doesn't really line up too well.
I mean, so prefacing anything said there, like, you know, obviously it's impossible for any one of us who isn't inside the studio to know. Whilst that narrative makes a certain amount of sense, it's definitely one of those things of like, you know, with speculation, we'll never truly know what it was like.
Yeah.
What I will say is that it's very clear the narrative team is really talented.
Yeah.
And, you know, I understand there's going to be someone out there who's shaking their head and being like, what the hell is he talking about? Bungie shill. But really, like, when you sit there and realize this is the same team that wrote all of the lore behind the raid and has written some incredible things around this expansion, you do realize that the team is talented. You can't dispute that fact. And so if it's one of those moments where, if this is something that has occurred, then you're looking at a moment where the narrative team may have been asked to make the best out of what they could. And you know what? All things considered, there's a lot of good stuff that I think they've been able to do on that particular front. Now, whether that's true or not, I don't know. It is entirely possible that, the blame lies somewhere for something or other. But I think the important thing to accept on that front is the fact that it is impossible to look at the narrative team through the lens of black and white, if you think on that front of things. Like, yeah, sure, they have most definitely given us a failure, so to speak, with the Lightfall campaign, but you can't immediately sit there and say that they are wholly defined by that alone. Like, there is great stuff that they've done there, and whether that's something to do with studio decision making and whatever's going on with things, it's really hard to go ahead and tell on this front of things. I think the one thing that I would go ahead and throw out there, though, is that when it comes down to it, there are people who are really passionate, like myself, about the game and about its story. But the thing that's really important is to remember that any of the devs who are working on this are passionate about it too. Like, I've sat down and spoken with members of Bungie's narrative team over the years, and not a single one of them has gone and given me the impression that they're phoning it in. Like, even if they only stay for a few years, even if they only manage to add a certain number of things to the game, they genuinely do care about the stuff that they're throwing out there into the world. They genuinely do care about what they're making. And so, I feel like that's something that should be thrown out there. It's really easy to say, game bad.
Yeah.
And, like, campaign was bad. But let's not forget for a moment that, like, hey, there are clearly devs that tried really hard on some of this. And no matter what the reasons are why the campaign was awful and didn't explain the Veil and a bunch of other bits and pieces, it's very clear that when we actually sit down and look at the way that games are made, sometimes it's really hard. And
there are a lot of teams. There are a lot of
passion
different
that goes into it.
Bungie's like 1,000 employees, and it's many teams of many people. And then there's, as I said before, like there's the lighting team, there's the sound design team, there's teams that are completely disconnected from what most people would criticize, who just like, well, I did my job great, but it's all like the skyboxes and the set design for Neo Moon. I think most people would agree that stuff is all top notch, as always with Bungie. The quality and the look and the feel of the game never disappoints, but some things that people may not like kind of just get thrown in with the entire rest of the game. And like I said, I think if you want to blame anyone, if anyone's to blame, developers, as always, they're always trying to do their best, designers, they're artists, but the leadership who make the decisions, it's kind of a tug of war between the leadership makes the decisions of this is what we're doing, this is when we're going to do it, this is what we want to release, we're going to change our mind, we're going to do this, that. But then the developers themselves, just they're doing their best with what they're told to do. So it's kind of a tug of war between the teams, and I can imagine it's quite messy. But also something I'd noticed is that it's the three, what would be seen as the three best expansions in Destiny would be Taken King, Forsaken, and Witch Queen. Those three are unanimously seen as the best expansions. The interesting thing I noticed is that those are all 1 year after the main game releases. So Destiny 1 in 2014, and then the next year you had Taken King to kind of make up for everything, and that was, heralded as just great still is to this day. And then Destiny 2 came out the next year. Forsaken came to just fix things, and both Destiny 1 and 2 launch was rocky. And then Beyond Light, which is kind of like the Destiny 3 but just put into Destiny 2, again very rocky because they took away a bunch of stuff, so it wasn't in a great state, and it was just messy, and they were trying to transition games. But then the next year you had Witch Queen, and that again was heralded as just great. And then, like you said, the fact that Lightfall came after Witch Queen is also why it's extra scrutinized, because Witch Queen was so good, and it kind of puts in perspective how good Witch Queen was. Like, it really
raised the bar,
and we knew at the time. But it trying to follow up after Witch Queen is tough, and Lightfall definitely struggles in that front. But it's
100%. I think it's also one of those things of like it has properly highlighted the fact that Destiny is a universe full of potential. And the characters that you've got there are great, but there's also certainly I mean, you know, there's certainly some strength to, in your last few expansions, wrapping up stories with with characters that you knew.